Everyone, thank you very much for joining us for our discussion entitled A Perspective from the Trenches, Challenges of Budgeting for Gene Therapies, Innovative Payment Systems that Work for Medicaid Departments, and What the States Need from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. My name is Tom Barker. I'm a partner at the law firm of Foley, Hoag. And let me just tee up the discussion a little bit, very, very briefly, and then turn it over to our distinguished panel. When the FDA approved the first CAR-T therapy back in the summer of 2017, the FDA said its approval decision was, quote, ushering in a new approach to the treatment of cancer and other serious and life-threatening diseases. CMS at the time said that the Medicare and Medicaid programs would, quote, ensure that beneficiaries have access to new and potentially life-saving treatments for patients who have nowhere else to turn. And the FDA noted earlier this year that cellular and gene therapy-related research and development in the United States continues to grow at a fast rate. With the approval of a cell-based gene therapy for beta thalassemia last August, and the recent BLA submissions to the FDA for sickle cell and beta thalassemia, state Medicaid agencies now are laser focused on payment for these innovative therapies. So how will state Medicaid agencies approach payment decisions for these therapies, especially as approvals become more common? What guidance do therapy sponsors need from CMS? Can innovative payment models work? Does the Medicaid drug rebate program and the associated regulations pose barriers to innovative payment models? And if so, does it need to change? That's what we'd like to discuss this afternoon. So I'll briefly introduce our distinguished panel. So to my right, Paul Jeffrey of Paul Jeffrey Consulting. Paul was the former Senior Director of Pharmacy for the MassHealth program, the Massachusetts Medicaid program. To my immediate left, Karen Kimsey with Spire Healthcare Strategies. Karen was the former Medicaid Director of the state of Virginia. And then to her left, Scott McGoohan, Executive Director of Policy and Alliance Development for Vertex Pharmaceuticals in Boston. So let me start off with you, if I may, Paul. Back in 2017, when the first CAR-T therapy was approved by the FDA, MassHealth announced that it was going to decouple payment for innovative therapies like the CAR-T therapies that were provided in the hospital setting from the underlying DRG and make a separate payment for those therapies. Can you tell us a little bit about why MassHealth adopted that strategy? It's an innovative payment model. Other states adopted that strategy after MassHealth did it. If you can tell us a little bit about the thinking that went into that, and also what industry group was the driver behind the initiative? Was it biotech pharma? Was it the hospitals? And did you approach CMS with a request for a state plan amendment? So just your thoughts on how that worked out.
Thanks for the question, Tom. And perhaps a little bit of an origin story. So I was the Director of Pharmacy for MassHealth for 20 years. In that position, I was embedded in the Medicaid program as an employee of UMass Medical School. So I was on the faculty and staff of UMass Medical School in an intrastate agency agreement with the Department of Health and Human Services. So that plays out in terms of the capacity that MassHealth had to do some innovation that may or may not have been likely in other states. So I was fortunate to practice in Massachusetts. Massachusetts has among the most generous Medicaid programs in the country. And as many of you know, it is a hotbed of innovation in academia and healthcare. So the environment, our ecosystem, was a good place for some experimentation, although that terminology isn't exactly permitted in the Medicaid program. But that said, for the last 8 years that I was there, our governor, it was a man named Charlie Baker. Charlie came out of state government, He was a CEO of a health plan, and he was with Bain Capital, Venture Capital. So when he became governor, he encouraged disruptive practices. The last 8 years I was there, the Medicaid director was Daniel Tsai. Dan is now the director of CMCS in the federal government. Dan came out of McKinsey as a very young man at partner and was also very much a disruptor. So let me just set the stage for why things happened the way they did in Massachusetts. When Kimraya came to the market, first, for many years, my team, which was excellent, had some suspicion about the way we paid for drugs in the hospital environment. We would see claims for drugs coming through in the way that we paid for drugs, and we would see a complete disconnect from what the hospitals charged, what the cost of the drugs were, and what we paid for it. And so even though that wasn't my purview, the hospital program, my colleague and I always had a suspicion that something needed to be done there. Then Kimraya came to the market, and we predicted that the methodology we used to pay for an episode of care in the hospital would be completely distorted by a drug that cost $400,000. So that said, when Kimraya came to the market, we were interested in entering into an agreement with the manufacturer for an outcome-based agreement, making sure that we ensured that the state was spending its money wisely. And I'll maybe a little bit more about that later. We didn't have that agreement in place at first, and the first claim we saw for a patient that was on Kimraya from a hospital was $1.2 million. So that was not what we intended to pay, but that's what they were submitting based on the cost-to-charge ratio and the way the bills were developed. So actually, Tom, the promoter of that idea was actually me. So when I had this awakening to what was going to happen and informed my senior management that if we didn't do something about this, we would be perpetually getting distorted bills and distorted reimbursement. So I made the proposal that we pull the drug out of the bundled payment. We used a methodology that was proprietary from 3M. It was called the APAD and the APEC. APAD was the average payment amount per discharge, and the APEC was a similar episode of care in the outpatient environment. So my team and I analyzed those, and when we plugged the numbers in, both of those payment systems were not designed and weren't capable of dealing with these very high investment medications. The higher the cost of the drug, the more distorted the outcome would be. So we said, my team, we presented to our executive team that we need to change this. And that's really where it came from. So a couple of things happened there. One is it gave us, when the drug is extracted from the inpatient hospital admission, by definition, it makes that drug a covered outpatient drug according to CMS rules. Well, covered outpatient drugs must participate in the Medicaid rebate program in order to be covered. So now we had an opportunity to get the Medicaid rebate, which is there's a statutory minimum for the rebate of 23.1% for brand name drugs. And Massachusetts was one of the first states to get CMS authority to negotiate outcomes-based agreements. So now we had a scenario where the drug was not part of the inpatient bundle. It's now a covered outpatient drug that puts it squarely in my basket for management. And I could guarantee at least a 23.1% rebate off of the wholesale acquisition cost. And I could talk to the manufacturers about my expectations or MassHealth's expectations about the performance of the drug. So we sat down with the manufacturers and we entered into an agreement with them about outcomes as well. So not only did we have an automatic discount, we had another discount based on the performance of the drug in the form of a rebate. So that's what drove all of that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Paul. And just a quick question. Did you go to CMS to get a SPA?
Thank you.
Or did you just do it?
So for those of you that don't know, states run their Medicaid program under a state plan. If you change that state plan, you have to petition CMS for a state plan amendment. Working with our counsel, we determined that we had the authority to do that under the current state plan. So this is where saying less is better, as most attorneys will tell you. So our state plan did not address this matter. So there was nothing for us to amend. So we deemed that we had the authority to do it. And in communication with the CMS pharmacy program, we met with no resistance for that because the rebate is shared with the federal government.
Yeah, they get a benefit.
So they
too.
get their share as well. So it was and it turned out that the manufacturers really liked it, and we can talk a little bit more about that. So this is a win-win-win, which is something that really doesn't happen very often in a negotiation or in healthcare.
Well, Karen, I think that's a nice segue to what I wanted to ask you next. So you were the Medicaid director of Virginia, and I know that you had been at Virginia Medicaid for years before you became Medicaid director. So you, like Paul, have a lot of experience with state Medicaid programs. So how would you, as Medicaid director in Virginia, how would you have approached a new payment model for an innovative therapy like Camira or the new cell and gene therapies that are going to start to be approved over the next couple of years? Would you have been willing to entertain an alternative payment arrangement like Paul did in Massachusetts? And what would you have needed from CMS to implement an alternative payment arrangement? Your thoughts on that, maybe?
Well, I just want to riff off of this piece. I understand your point. We tended to say sometimes it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission. So, you know, just on that sense, just like being disruptors that we are in certain cases. But it's great to be here with you all. I was with Medicaid for 27 years, as most of my career, last 12 in executive level roles. And so I actually had personal experience with it when Zolgensma came through. But just first to talk about, for the audience to be aware, with Medicaid you likely are, but states operate their programs in various different aspects. So generally it's a good number do fee-for-service, where they contract directly with companies to do the surface authorizations, claims payment, taking care of the members. Then you have lion's share of Medicaid programs are now shifting to hiring managed care organizations, HMOs, to help them with managing the program. So that's where it gets more interesting, because when you're dealing with one state and they're fee-for-service, and you're just interacting with the one state. But when you have a state that has managed care organizations, not only have the state to deal with, you have their MCOs to negotiate with as well, which makes it very interesting dynamic. So for states, the first thing all state people will think about is we want to have access. We want our members to get the care that they need that will be life-transforming, life-saving, quality of life, big first and foremost. Everyone cares about that. But what's really a big piece too is its efficacy. Is it going to work? Will it really last? And with clinical studies out there, people pay attention to that, but they also want to see some real life experience. And then third, not to be left out, is the cost. So states grapple with this because most run on a 2-year budget cycle, with 1 year being the primary component where they adjust and get their big cost asks in. And legislatures are watching it very closely. So keeping all this in mind, if you're a fee-for-service state and a drug like this comes through, then you just pay the cost directly. But if you have health plans, sometimes you have in your contracts with the managed care organizations, states handle it a little bit differently in how they adjust for risk and pharmacy costs. So some put it full risk on the plans to absorb, which Virginia did. Others do risk corridors or reinsurance. So for a certain amount, the plans pay up to a certain amount, then whatever that cost difference is, the state absorbs the rest. So that's important as well. Some completely carve it out and the state just pays it, just like they would in a fee-for-service. So for Virginia, when Zolgensma came out, we only had it at full risk. Plans pay for the cost. There's a general belief at the state legislature that the drugs were very costly and that the rebates and everything was very important, that the plans had the means to cover the differences, whatever they were, before Zolgensma came out with gene and cell therapies. So what happened is it suddenly popped up. There were 2 children who are eligible for the medication treatment, and it was very rapid. They've been trying to work with a health plan And it just so happened there was one health plan that had both children. And so the system was VCU Health System, and we received a rapid call, urgent, dire need. We can't get the authorization, the child doesn't receive it within 2 weeks, they missed the window. So it became very dramatic for us very quickly. And of course, we had the health plan pay for it. We said, you have to pay for it, it's in your contract. But what it did was generate this significant discussion about, is the process we have in place, is that going to work for these types of advanced therapies, and what other creative solutions do we need, like you were talking about with unbundling and DRG payments, and how all of this reacts. And so the bottom line is yes, Medicaid programs want to find creative solutions to help address this, because they want to make sure that people get these treatments, but they also, it's a publicly funded program. They have to balance their budgets. They don't have the authority to spend these on their own necessarily, and they will have to get approval from their state legislatures at the same time. There's a lot of creativity within that. Some states have a lot, some do not. Some, for every penny that's spent, they have to have authority and permission. So for each Medicaid program you see one. There are some states that are starting to align, like with treatments and how they approve that through the SPAs, and like 10 plus states already have that, so they followed your lead in terms of that piece. But it's definitely going to be an ongoing and open conversation to be held related to this, how states move forward. So I think and even at the most recent NAMD Medicaid Directors Conference just last week, there were even meetings being held, presentations about this very topic, and it's very important for them. So you can tell, and I agree with you, that it's at the top of everybody's minds right now, trying to figure out the best way, and in partnering pressures with CMS on how to allow them to have that flexibility to do that.
And I'll just add to that, so with Camira, Zolgensma, Luxturna, those are relatively rare diseases and
Yes.
not a lot of patients, but when the therapies for sickle cell, sickle
Yes.
is not as rare a disease as spinal muscular atrophy, for example. And so I think you are right, that the states are really focused on it now.
They're afraid. There's a growing concern about the budget and how they're going to handle the cost. So when we're talking about sickle cell, everybody's talking about this. They're excited about it, that it's coming out, but they just simply are trying to figure out the best way to manage it. So for one, like you're seeing some initial reactions to some of the states are doing is, and even the health plans, you see them being more restrictive with clinical criteria. You see them targeting populations versus, well, it was just in the trials, it was targeting this population, it was approved for this, so we're only going to limit it to this population. So you're seeing a lot of approaches that way. And with sickle cell, there's going to be a heightened focus of how are you going to be able to really target those individuals who are going to benefit from this, and then how are they going to handle the costs moving forward.
Yeah.
And specifically, a lot of discussions are, and we'll move more into it, about value-based arrangements, payment arrangements.
So Scott, from a manufacturer's perspective now, so we've heard from Karen and Paul from the perspective of a state, but from a manufacturer's perspective, what do manufacturers need from CMS and from state Medicaid agencies? And you're with Vertex, which is, as I said in the introduction, based in Boston. If Vertex came up with an alternative payment mechanism theory, how would you approach MassHealth as a Massachusetts? Or would you go into MassHealth directly? Would you work with MassBio? Would you work with Pharma? How would you approach the state or CMS? And what do you think states and CMS need from the perspective of, what do states need from what do states need from CMS from the perspective of a manufacturer?
Sure. No, it's a great question, and I've really appreciated the chance to hear from two Commonwealths for how you've approached each one of these challenges. And I think, it's fair for us to take a step back, and also I liked, Karen, your comment about it's better to ask forgiveness than permission. And I'd say when it comes to cell and gene therapy launches, our rule is a bit different. Our rule is no surprises, because each one of us here is trying to focus on the same end goal. We have fantastic innovation that is being developed by many of the members and folks in attendance here that holds an incalculable promise for the ability to treat and manage conditions that have heretofore not had enough options available. So we are all focused on doing the right thing and doing the same thing, which is ensuring that therapies are not just available, that they're accessible. And that's where this advanced warning, advanced planning, and making sure folks understand everything we understand before the approval is something that's been really, really critical to us moving forward. I think it's also fair to step back and look at what have we seen so far with what Paul's talked about MassHealth, what we've heard about other states. We're still gaining experience here, and each cell and gene therapy launch is teaching us something new. We started with the CAR-Ts, where you had inpatient CAR-T therapies that were bridging to outpatient that had, at that time, was a list cost that was many-fold lower than what we've seen in recent cell and gene therapy launches, and all the same few thousand patients, each one of these launches targeting the same patient population. Now we're in a situation where states are gaining experience. You have more and more launches. We're moving from outpatient back to inpatient without a foreseeable plan to get to the outpatient. As well as the fact that exposure for Medicaid programs is growing, not just based on indication size, but based on payer mix for these types of conditions. For sickle cell, for instance, 45% of individuals living with sickle cell disease receive their health insurance coverage under Medicaid programs. So that is a fundamental inversion of what we saw in many of the cancer therapies to date. Right now, as we look at where states are, many are in very different places. Certain Medicaid programs like MassHealth and others were very forward-leaning with gubernatorial support pushing them in that direction. And others, frankly, are trying to do the basic work of managing their own beneficiary needs and programmatic needs and may not have the resources or flexibility or support to move into these directions. So right now, we can really fold these into three basic categories. There are outstanding questions from many about what authorities are available to a state Medicaid to manage these. Everything Paul outlined, and I'm sure it was a journey into learning about, can you separate from a bundled payment? Can you get a rebate for that? All of that is not necessarily known and accepted across the country for Medicaid programs. Secondarily, to go below the federal layer to the state layer, states also have to determine what can they do within their own operating parameters, their state plans, their own regulations, and what may need to change to best accommodate cell and gene therapies. And then lastly, to ensure everything moves smoothly, how does a Medicaid program communicate guidance to the institutions who have to code and bill appropriately to ensure that the entire system works, patients get access, institutions get reimbursed, and the system can function as intended? Now, the question about CMS has done an incredible amount to date. They have done a lot of forward-leaning thinking around multiple best price avenues for how one would report what your best price is under different types of value-based payment arrangements. They've also been exploring a demonstration project that I think we'll be hearing more about over the course of these few days. But frankly, what I think right now we need a bit of is two things. One, time and advice. There needs to be greater time in field for folks to get a full grasp, for Medicaid programs to share what they have learned with their colleagues, and then also for CMS to provide that type of advice about what is available, how they can achieve these access strategies, and ultimately what has been tested and what is approved under CMS's existing statute. The last question you asked was about outcomes-based arrangements, value-based payment arrangements. Many of these tools that could be important ways in which to align payment with performance and ensure sustainable reimbursement for this promising field. And Vertex, like many, is out there exploring these types of arrangements. What we're trying to also be is flexible and receptive to the needs of different payers. Not all payers view things the same way, and also not all products and diseases are going to be ideal for a value-based payment arrangement. I think one intellectual exercise for the audience is to think about the performance exposure for a cell and gene therapy product with, say, a 60% response rate versus a 95% response rate. It may be a far more attractive candidate for a value-based payment arrangement if you have a lower response rate than if you have a higher. You have a greater likelihood that the product may perform as intended across a substantial majority of the population. So again, these are tools that are important to have, that we need to continue to explore and learn about and see when they are appropriate, but they're not going to be one-size-fits-all solutions.
So two comments to what you just said. Number one, I want to come back to your comment about efficacy, and I'd be curious to hear Karen's and Paul's thoughts on that. What's the state Medicaid agency going to be looking for in terms of efficacy? And then I also want to say, I agree with you completely about how CMS is approaching, how thoughtfully CMS is approaching these questions. It seems to me that this is one of the very few areas where this is not political, where this is not a Republican versus Democrat, because the Trump administration was thinking about it, the Biden administration is thinking about it, and they're thinking about it in a very, very thoughtful way. Calder was thinking about it when he was there, and Dan is thinking about it now when he's there. Dan has the experience, of course, because he was MassHealth commissioner when the payment strategy for Camira, when you developed the payment strategy for Camira. But Scott, I want to ask you one more question. So again, you're based in Boston. So what happens when someone from Montana shows up at Mass General Brigham or at VCU with a need for, it's next summer, and so the sickle therapies have now been, the BLAs have been approved for sickle. How does a state Medicaid agency respond, and what does a manufacturer need when an out-of-state patient shows up who's obviously the Montana child is not a MassHealth beneficiary? So how does that work out, and what type of guidance is necessary from a manufacturer's perspective?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it will be a reality for this area of medicine in particular. For looking at cell and gene therapy launches, going from Luxturna, which launched with 2 treatment centers at its commercial launch, to now CAR-T, where it's available at more than 125 centers nationwide, there are going to be states that will not have a treatment center available at launch or potentially ever in the course of a cell and gene therapy. There are many reasons for that, but that is a truism right now in the field, and so this situation will present itself quite a lot. For folks who may not be familiar, when you have a patient who is seeking a treatment out of state, their home state Medicaid is still responsible for payment and for coverage of that therapy. It's not as though by visiting the Commonwealth of Virginia, Virginia would somehow assume liability financially and otherwise for that patient. And so what happens is, if you take a hypothetical treatment center in, now I'll go back to my law school where we would talk about in the state of denial to avoid singling out any state. So in the state of D, if we are trying to go to that treatment center to receive its cell and gene therapy, that treatment center has to elect to accept the terms and conditions of the home state's payment policies. They are not obligated to treat and to accept that patient for treatment unless they can come to that agreement with the home state. So it becomes a very complicated scenario. It also underscores why, if you are a hypothetical company who's going to be launching with 10 or 20 centers in 5 and 10 states at launch, you still need to ensure access and work with the Medicaid programs across the country, because patients are everywhere and patients everywhere deserve access. So it comes to be a very, very complicated situation. What you may also see is, if you have, say, a state that may have a very low population period and a low prevalence of disease, you may not see formal policy development, but instead it would be managed by what are called single case agreements, where the beneficiary physician writes the script, begins the discussion that they may not have really thought through to the conclusion at that time, and then the Medicaid program will work it out with the institution at hand, with the physician, to understand how can they address this single case, and then potentially down the line consider a more comprehensive policy. So it will be a reality. It's something we and many others are currently working on, and we take very seriously to, again, ensure that patients have access. It's not a question of if, it's a question of how.
Thanks. Paul, I want to go back to you to further explore this question about what a state Medicaid agency is going to be looking for from a sponsor that wants to develop an alternative payment arrangement. Specifically, what evidence are you going to be looking for from the sponsor? Durability? And if so, over what period of time? Efficacy? Are the results of the FDA clinical trials going to be persuasive for the state Medicaid agency? And the reason that I'm focused on you for this question, Paul, is because when you were there, Governor Baker came up with the proposal where UMass, with the Chan Medical School, would also independently assess the FDA's clinical data in order to make a coverage decision for the drug. And so maybe you can sort of weave that into your answer, but I'm curious to know from your perspective, and also Karen's, what's a state Medicaid agency going to be looking for in terms of efficacy and durability? With spinal muscular atrophy and Zolgensma, we had strong evidence of efficacy, 90+%. But what about the example that Scott used where the efficacy is 60%? What are you going to be looking for, and what ability does a state have to second guess an FDA approval decision?
Well, that's a lot to unpack. So let's start with the FDA's decision. So today, currently, there's a lot of discussion about how a payer should deal with a drug that receives accelerated approval. So accelerated approval is not full approval, although it is approval that the FDA keeps reminding us. That said, it creates questions about the durability and perhaps even the efficacy of the product. A product that's approved based on a surrogate marker, a couple of times that didn't go well, particularly, let's say, with Exondys 51 for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. There was a lot of disbelief that that drug, moving a biomarker less than 1%, was actually going to convey a clinical benefit. So states would, and certainly my team, and once again, I'll acknowledge that we had great resources. I had pharmacoeconomists on my team. We had a pharmacoeconomy fellowship, worked with the quantitative health sciences unit at UMass Medical School. I had a lot of internal talent. So we were able to critically evaluate these studies to determine what ultimately would become our value assessment of the product. So as Tom was mentioning, in 2019, Massachusetts actually passed a law, so we received the authority to set a fair market value for pharmaceuticals in Massachusetts that met a certain threshold. Well, that was my team that did all that work. We had to build that infrastructure. So we created algorithms for doing that, and we had to socialize all of that in the lawmaking process. So just an aside, the disability advocacy community would not allow us to use quality-adjusted life years in that assessment. Well, that's pretty foundational stuff when you're talking about value and cost benefit. For example, we also could not use ICER, a profound influence in the market today, because they use QALYs. So the disability advocacy community said, we're going to kill this law if you have either ICER as a source or use QALYs, for example. So we had a lot of limitations. So when we hired our pharmacoeconomists, we asked them how they would develop the value proposition for a product without using either of those two things. So when we hired the person that answered that question best. That said, another issue with in addition to the accelerated approval is the phenomenon where a developer will can put its clinical trials together in a certain manner in which they demonstrate efficacy for the drug, and it's in a subpopulation of the disease state. And then the manufacturer gets a full broad label for their product. So there were drugs for ALS, for example, that had was used in a very highly controlled, specific population. Yet when the product got its label, it was for anybody with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. So it was like, all right, well, now we have a very expensive therapy for which has been demonstrated efficacy and not great efficacy in a very limited population, but now anybody is permitted to use it under the FDA label. So we would make a determination then about how we were going to manage that drug. So my team did all the utilization management. We set the criteria, we set the monitoring standards, we engaged the experts to make sure we were doing this to the best of our ability to do what Karen said. Everybody wants the patients who are going to benefit from the therapy to get it. There's nobody that doesn't have that as their primary objective. So how do we do that in a way that we also meet our fiduciary responsibility to the taxpayers, both federal and state? So we had this dynamic that we had to work to. So my team on a drug that was a 60% efficacy, we would be, table stakes are that the manufacturer is going to have to come to us with some kind of a guarantee for performance. Flat, period, end of discussion. Now that said, there's nothing that makes the manufacturer enter into an agreement with me. There's no mandatory requirement. I can't require that necessarily. I can be a tough negotiator, and I can, say things like, well, if we don't get something from you, I'm going to manage this drug to exactly the clinical trial specifications. And the manufacturer's going to go, well, geez, but our label is this. I said, yeah, okay. Yeah, tell me more. So you haven't demonstrated efficacy in this other population. And by the way, the population you studied doesn't look anything like the MassHealth population, because you had all white people in this study, and I have a very diverse population. So let's talk about health disparities. How are you going to cover that angle? So, and I turned out I was a tough negotiator. I didn't know I had that in me until the results came in. My executive said, "Hey, you're pretty good at this." I said, "Yeah, thank you." So the expectation is going to be based on the clinical evidence, the population that we're serving. We do take a strong eye, and have for years in the Medicaid program, to health disparities. And then what the economics are. What is the value proposition? So a lot of patients in Medicaid stay in Medicaid, or if they're older, they graduate into the Medicare program. So it becomes a public funding issue. That's a very different story for commercial insurance, particularly employer insurance, which is now dominant in the commercial market. Over 30% of the market is self-employed. So we have to take all of these, we take the economics in after we've satisfied the clinical question. Does it work? And if it works, yes. In what population? If it's a narrow population and there's not guaranteed efficacy like there was with Sovaldi, for example, in hepatitis, or what we're expecting to see with sickle cell disease, then we're going to expect that the manufacturer stand behind the product. And that can come a bunch of different ways. And this whole outcomes-based or value-based agreement is morphing. It's new. Right now, I think 15 states-ish have the authority to enter into outcomes-based agreements, so it's not universal. It's high touch. You need a lot of resources to do that. When I left, MassHealth had 10 outcomes-based agreements, and we were by far and away the most in the country, by leaps and bounds. We also were creative in our contracting. So we may have had a contract that had 3 different pieces to it. An entry-level agreement, a subscription-type agreement, you have to treat at least 20 patients or whatever the number is, and then an outcomes-based agreement. If it didn't work according to what we agreed upon in the contract, then we'd get a higher rebate. So we had several outcomes-based agreements that were there were 3 levers in them that we could exercise. So creative contracting was an issue as well. So all of that goes into it, Tom. I don't know if I really answered your question, but it's you talked about laser focus. It's also was a state law in Massachusetts to do this fair market value assessment. So it wasn't an option. We had to do that. I had to put a team together. I had to enhance my team to be able to do that.
And you also, in your response, raised an issue that I neglected to mention, which is the answer different if the drug is approved under one of the accelerated pathways versus regular approval? And I think you did answer that question. And we certainly saw that with the therapy for muscular dystrophy, which was approved under an accelerated pathway.
There's a lot of unevenness in the market by therapeutic category. Oncology drugs pretty much get a free ride. I'm not sure I'm 100% comfortable with that. So almost all of them are approved based on an accelerated approval, yet we don't go through the kind of rigorous process to manage them that we might do for certain other drugs. And that's an artifact of, if we had another half an hour, we could talk about how we got to that spot. But it's true, some of these domains are sacrosanct, and we have to, and that's cultural, and we have to honor that, and because it's a real thing, what you perceive is reality.
So Karen, an issue that we've sort of been dancing around and haven't really focused on, I'd like to ask you about. So the Medicaid drug rebate statute was enacted in 1991. So it's 32 years old, and it predates CAR T, cell and gene therapy. it predates it predates CRISPR. All of the new therapies that we're talking about today weren't around in 1991. Does the drug rebate program need to change? So Scott had mentioned that CMS has done a lot of good thinking about multiple best prices, for example. But at some point, does Congress really need to step in and revisit a 32-year-old statute and say, it worked great when we were talking about beta blockers, and I'm not even sure if like simvastatin had been approved in 1991. It worked great when we were talking about pills that you take for high blood pressure and high cholesterol, but does it work as well today? And I'd sort of be curious to know your thoughts. Do manufacturers need to go to Congress, do state Medicaid agencies need to go to Congress and say, we really need to revisit the way the drug rebate statute works?
The answer is could be. And I say that because states, for whatever it is, any big changes in the Medicaid program take time. And yes, it's been much faster now. Very excited to see that. But again, it's turning Titanic sometimes, because especially the one time I saw it really advance was during COVID. Opened up so many flexibilities. It just really changed things. So I think you're going to see faster movement, more creativity, because they really did have that chance to see and feel how creative you can be with the Medicaid program if you just open up and be flexible with some of these rules. Not quite sure if it's time yet to start talking to Congress, because they'll probably start asking, where's your evidence? Where's your examples? Where's the real life experience? And you're still moving on that, still working on that. And here's another complicating interest. State Medicaid programs depend on these rebates as a part of their budgeting process. It's very important. They calculate in, they factor it in as part of their budget cycle. So if you change that formula, that offset, the states are going to look for, well, where is the other offset going to come? It's just the reality in costing and paying for publicly funded programs. So the answer is yes, could be. But you still need to have some more experience related to it to actually be able to demonstrate the reason why you wish to have a change. And how these value-based arrangements are going to help show that. And I agree about approaching it in manufacturers. When you're working with state Medicaid programs, a lot of them are looking at health equity. It's not just enough to have the insurance, but accessing it and utilizing it. So if you can align with their priorities and say, we can help you meet health equity, meet access care, help improve the overall quality for people and health and meet those measurable outcomes that they're seeking, then that's another positive aspect. I would absolutely try and tie it to that as another lever for moving in and starting to have those conversations. And I agree, CMS is moving. They're trying, for example, and the gene therapy model. Now this is interesting because they're saying, states, we're going to help you with this. You give up your authority, you delegate that piece to us, and we will negotiate with the manufacturers to get the best outcome. Well, I'm not sure, and there may be some states that will say, yes, we're going to take you up on that. There will be others that will say, it is ours to decide, ours to control. We will not allow CMS to make that decision for us. So that while CMS is moving forward, there are some aspects of those models, what they're demonstrating and showing, not every state is going to agree with that or move forward on that as well. So I think the answer is it's still open. There is always opportunity. I'm always the optimist in saying we can look at things, but the realities are you have to take those into account first.
Maybe if I could get your perspective on a question that I asked Scott a few minutes ago, and that is, excuse me, the Montana Medicaid beneficiary who shows up at VCU or Mass General Brigham. Scott's right. They're a Montana Medicaid patient. Montana Medicaid's on the hook. Almost surely Mass General Brigham and VCU do not have provider agreements with the state of Montana. So what does Congress need to do, or what does CMS need to do to ease the ability? Because there may be 150 treatment centers for sickle cell, but I'm guessing that there won't be any or many in some of the low population states. So is that, I'd sort of like to get your perspective as Medicaid officials on that question.
I'm not, I mean, so right now it's technically, the FDA says if it's covered, you have to cover it. So the biggest piece for CMS is just enforcing and making sure states are covering it. But I think what gets interesting, so it's a little early yet, I mean, they can enforce, but right now it's really about states saying, yes, we're going to cover this service for this individual. And there's precedent already out there for that, with individuals who have, life-threatening conditions or other medical needs where they have to go out of state and get authorized for that anyway. So work with the state that you're in, identify if there are protocols in place that allow for that. What are those? What are they set up to be? Generally, like for us in Virginia, we actually work in tandem with all the health plans. So we had 5 managed care organizations. The big issue too is making sure there's consistency in the approval process. So one plan may approve it, but another may not, or even the fee-for-service, the team in the Medicaid program may disagree and not approve it. So that's the big piece, is making sure you're aligning on what you're going to agree to, the protocol, like what are the criteria for admitting somebody, and then how are you going to pay for that? They pay for people to travel, okay? And if they tell you otherwise, that's wrong. I'm just saying it outright. Now, what make it tricky is if people, they want to bring their entire family with them, then they're not going to cover that, and yes, that happens a lot. So, especially if it's a child. But set the protocols in place, put those in writing, make sure that they're honored and followed. And then for CMS, it's more going to be an enforcement piece and making sure the states are doing the right thing. But I agree with you, with single case agreements, it would be more ideal to have maybe a compact or a different type of arrangements where states can agree in groups that we're going to cover together if they go out of state, and a recognition of that, versus having to reach a single case agreement every single time that happens. That's not in the best interests of the individual who needs the care.
Okay. Paul, anything to add to that?
Not so much. I think that one thing that you made me think of, though, is that many states, so Massachusetts has 5 or 6 different partner organizations for delivering the benefit, managed care organizations, but every MassHealth member is in an accountable care organization. And some of them, the accountable care organizations, accumulate around a managed care organization to serve as an administrative services organization. Complex. So my team, again, looking at this, we realized that to address the issues of particularly plans coming to different treatment decisions based on the same drug and the same patient characteristics, we, like a number of states in the country, are moving to a single formulary. So right now, in the Medicaid program in Massachusetts, and over the years incrementally, we've mandated that all of our managed care plans manage their drug benefit exactly the way that the state tells them to. So even to the carve-out issue in Massachusetts. So one of our managed care partners that has a contract with the hospital, and they're paying for Kymriah or a gene therapy, that still has to be carved out of the package so that I can negotiate the outcomes-based agreement for that particular drug, no matter where in the MassHealth member universe that patient sits. So, and this is not, we're not the only state to do this, we're not the first state to do it. So I predict that there's going to be more uniformity in the way a single state manages, regardless of how many managed care organizations. And it would be useful for there to be some kind of a coordinating effort. There are several already that exist in the Medicaid program, numerous kind of buying groups of one stripe or another. That's essentially what CMMI is trying to do with the gene therapy. I have great doubts that it'll be very successful for what you mentioned, Karen. But that said, some type of overarching infrastructure network would be useful so that not everybody is replicating the same thing over and over again. And states that have resources like my state did don't have to behave differently from a state that is under-resourced.
Yeah, if I can add one other element, one of the most frequent questions we have gotten in the time that we have been out having early discussions with payers of all type is, how are other payers managing this? Folks are trying to learn from one another, to not reinvent the wheel. And I also think you were 100% correct in the question about what does the government, what does the legislature potentially have to do? And right now, we are still learning We're learning about these tools. We're learning about these approaches. We're learning when they are best suited to ensuring patient access and when another one may be preferable. So if we look back at ways in which federal and state jointly administered insurance programs have evolved, those have taken between 5 and 10 years or more, if ever, to materialize. So I think right now we are in a state of learning, hopefully one in which we'll see continued success in models being disseminated across the country. But I think for large-scale federal intervention, I think it is unlikely in the short term, but we should all remain clear-eyed about what we're trying to achieve and ensuring that we're actually being successful in making steps towards that goal.
A quick note to that is oftentimes the states serve as a crucible where experiments happen. You can think about, again, in Massachusetts, because I'm very familiar with that, Romney Care in 2006 was kind of a foundational model for Obamacare with the Affordable Care Act. You will see some issues in the, some reflection of the Massachusetts Fair Market Value Law in the Inflation Reduction Act. For negotiating contracts for Medicare. So some of that comes from the states, and I expect to continue to see that. But we are a long way from having, dare I whisper, a single payer type of approach.
or a Medicare Part G gene therapy.
There you go. Oh, there you
nice.
go.
Very nice.
Why not, right?
Well, I'd like to thank the panel for this, this really thoughtful and thought-provoking discussion. Thank you very much for your time, Paul, Karen, and Scott. And I want to give time for the next session that's starting in just a couple of minutes. So does anyone have any questions for the panel? I think by this clock here, we have 1 minute left, but by my watch, we have 6 minutes left. So,
We've still got at least 5.
6 minutes.
Oh.
Yeah.
so if anyone has any questions,
There's one.
feel free. Oh, yes, right there.
Hi. So I have a question. So many of the sickle cell patients who have Medi-Cal and then maybe some state level services are all being sort of shepherded into a managed care program. And what we're finding is that there are people making decisions about their health care based on whatever their processes are, and they're lacking in getting what they need. So there's a real kind of fear of how, if they can't get the standard of care, how are they going to have access or be healthy enough to have gene therapy when it's there? And so in your discussions, I just kind of wanted to say to you, this is what's going on, this is a reality. And so in your discussions, maybe you can sort of put that in the mix and see, because it's really real. So we don't want to be told that we don't want gene therapy if we can't, and it's a fact that we can't actually get to it because there are roadblocks being put in our way. And this whole thing of managed care when you have a specialized illness is very, very scary to us. So just please.
I think that's so critical. And Adrian, the fact of the matter is too many conversations impacting patient care, coverage, and access have not been informed by community voices equally across the country. And we need to make sure that that voice is brought in, that it is guiding and shaping and informing these discussions to make sure folks get the right care. And to your point also about ensuring that people have the ability to have whatever is the most appropriate therapy, whether it's a cell and gene therapy, whether it's another therapy, innovator, generic, whatever the case may be, we need to be supporting access in all forms where appropriate, where justified, whether allowed. So it's really something we take into account, but it's an excellent point.
I agree. I could not agree more, actually. One of the pieces, and I think I mentioned it earlier, it's not enough to have health coverage. You have to be able to use it. And not everybody, especially in our programs, feels safe or comfortable enough to advocate for what they need, or even understands it well enough to even be able to do that. And so that's why it's going to be very important to bring the advocates in, families, people who actually have the conditions that you're talking about, to describe and discuss how the approach will be to access these services, and then have the state embed it in contracts, requirements, bulletins, to make sure, and have exceptions in place for managed care contracts where somebody has a clinical need for the service that cannot be met by that plan, they can be exempted out and receive the care in another way.
I'm hopeful that we will do a better job of that, absolutely. And just a couple of points to punctuate that. The Food and Drug Administration now has embedded the patient voice in many of its decision-making processes. Yes. The health equity issue is front and center with almost every state Medicaid program that I know about. And as I mentioned relative to the pharmacy formulary in Massachusetts, we made it uniform so that there would be no excuse for one of our managed care partners to do something different from what the state dictates. We put all of our patients in accountable care organizations in Massachusetts. They all have to have community partners so that we have a voice within the plan itself, that patients with a complaint like the one you expressed have a place to go with it. We have a ways to go, but I'm optimistic and very hopeful that we will erase that problem at some time in the not too distant future. I think actually sickle cell disease is going to be transformative.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, again, thank you to the panel, and thanks to all of you for your participation and your interest, and enjoy the rest of the conference. And thanks to ARM for putting this together.